discussion board, I chose the question on Puritanism and how they impacted America's founding. And in the book Democracy in America that was written by Alexis de Tocqueville, he considers, as one author put it, Puritans to be America's founders because they had a formative influence on our nation's character. The Puritans and the founding fathers of the late 1700s have more in common than I realized, and I was a little surprised by the amount of connections the two have, given their vast period of time that separates the two groups of people. The first would be, with Puritans, this idea of congregational polity and the fact that their way of electing representatives for their church was through people in the church serving in a publicly elected position of leadership. It was completely different from Episcopal polity, from Presbyterian polity. The Puritans decided to go a completely different route. The founders did the same thing. The founders decided they were going to go the same route, doing a representative democracy. By having a representative democracy, the people have a say. Just as the church members had a say, the American people would have a say in who represents them in their nation's government. The second idea that connects the two is the idea of the covenant, and that when one is saved, there is a covenant that God makes with this new believer. This covenant is of utmost importance for the new believer because there is a personal responsibility, according to Puritans, that that person must fulfill. In fulfilling this responsibility, the major push that one must strive to fulfill is obeying God's law. By obeying God's law, and by the Puritans having a society of laws, they can be blessed by God. In turn, the United States was the same way. The United States, based off of Christian principles, having a society of laws, and honoring God, and two, God will bless the nation. Of course, you've got the verse, if my people will humble themselves and pray. It goes on to say, I will heal their land. So there is this idea that both groups putting God first. Obeying God's law is the prime directive, if you will, of society. George Whitefield saw that his personal responsibility, even though George Whitefield was not a Puritan per se, he grew up learning their teachings, that George Whitefield, his personal responsibility was to preach the Word of God to those that needed it. And the Puritans, even though their influence declined after that first generation of settlers, their influenced several different preachers in the First Great Awakening era, such as George Whitefield, who sowed seeds for those that would serve during the Revolutionary era. The last major connection, if you will, that I found between the Puritans and Christianity both in the founding of America and throughout America's history as a whole, even in modern day today in the 21st century, is the decline. One might think, well, Christianity isn't declining today. Well, if you look as a whole from where we were 30 years ago, 50 years ago, even 100 years ago, 200 years ago, we have declined. We have drawn back, pulled God out of the public schools. And in doing so, there's one author that stated, this is the direct result of materialism. Materialism, the love of wealth and the love of money, declined the way of Puritan life. It has declined the way of Christianity in America today.